Hello, dear travelers. Tonight, we're going to drift into a time long forgotten, a time when the very air around you was wildly different. Imagine breathing air so rich in oxygen that every breath felt electric, and life itself grew larger, faster, and more intense. Yes, there was once a time when Earth's atmosphere held 35% oxygen. But what did that do to life? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far this story travels. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's explore how a shift in something as invisible as air reshaped the visible world forever. Long before the world we know today took shape, Earth's atmosphere underwent a transformation so profound, so silent, that it reshaped the very direction of life itself. During the late Paleozoic era, roughly 300 million years ago, oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to rise dramatically. Not just a small increase, but a leap from the relatively stable 21% we experience today to an astonishing 35%. It's a figure difficult to comprehend at first glance, but its impact was everywhere, in every breath, in every living cell, in every corner of the biosphere. The story begins with the plants. Vast, swampy forests dominated much of the land during this time, filled with primitive trees like lycophytes, horsetails, and seed ferns. These plants grew rapidly, reaching sizes far greater than their modern relatives. But more importantly, they had an unmatched ability to produce oxygen. Photosynthesis was in overdrive, and because microbes capable of efficiently breaking down lignin, the tough substance in wood, had not yet evolved, much of this plant matter simply didn't decompose. Instead, it was buried and trapped underground, locking away carbon and allowing more and more oxygen to accumulate in the air. As oxygen levels climbed, the atmosphere itself changed. Breathing would have felt different, easier, perhaps even slightly dizzying. Flames burned hotter, insects grew larger, and animals adapted in unexpected ways. This wasn't just a minor atmospheric fluctuation. It was a planetary shift, one that unfolded slowly over millions of years, but with consequences that rippled through every living thing. With each percentage point of oxygen added to the air, metabolic processes in animals became more efficient. Muscles required less effort to move. Movement became easier. Recovery from exertion happened faster. The energy demands of life could now be met with greater ease, and organisms began to change in kind. Aerobic respiration, the use of oxygen to generate energy, became a supercharged engine, and with it came evolutionary opportunities that had never before been possible. But this abundance was not evenly felt. It began first in the wetlands and forests, those dense green chambers of carbon exchange. The great coal swamps of the Carboniferous period became the oxygen factories of the world. These forests stretched across what are now North America and Europe, vast expanses of towering vegetation whose sheer biomass poured oxygen into the atmosphere day after day. Without the biological infrastructure to break down all this plant material, Earth was effectively breathing in and holding its breath for millions of years. Yet, the increase in oxygen wasn't just a matter of breathing easier. It altered chemical reactions in the environment. Iron rusted more quickly. Lightning became more potent. Even the color of the sky may have subtly shifted under the weight of so much O2. Fire, once a rare and localized phenomenon, could now spread rapidly, ignited more easily, and fueled by the highly oxygenated air. This new environment brought new risks, but also extraordinary potential. Many organisms thrived. Amphibians, which had already made the leap from water to land, now found themselves in a world where respiration was less taxing. Some species began to grow larger. The energy available in each breath allowed them to explore new territories, adapt new behaviors, and evolve novel structures. Life, in a way, was expanding not just outward, but upward, reaching toward new sizes, new niches, and new ecological balances. The fossil record from this period begins to tell a silent story of transformation. Creatures grew not just in diversity, but in scale. The forests themselves, untouched by the decay of modern fungi and bacteria, became deep, dark, oxygen-producing machines. They didn't just support life, they supercharged it. And the atmosphere above them grew thick with breath. Every gust of wind a current of chemical possibility. This world, this ancient breathing earth, is difficult for us to fully imagine. We live in a time where oxygen is abundant, yes, but stable, predictable. In the Paleozoic, it was anything but. Every evolutionary step taken by life at that time was shadowed by the atmosphere's generosity, and every adaptation was shaped by air that was richer, more volatile, more alive. It was a time of energy and expansion, and the story was only just beginning. In this oxygen-rich world, where the atmosphere pulsed with vitality and potential, life didn't just adapt, it transformed. Nowhere was this transformation more astonishing than among the invertebrates. Creatures that had once crawled through leaf litter or darted between blades of grass began to stretch, to lengthen, to reach toward an evolutionary scale that seems almost mythological to us today. The most iconic example, one that has captured the imagination of scientists and storytellers alike, is the giant dragonfly Meganeura, a prehistoric predator with a wingspan reaching nearly 70 centimeters, rivaling that of modern hawks. But this was not a singular anomaly. It was part of a much broader pattern. Insects, arachnids, and other arthropods exploded in size during this period, and oxygen was the silent architect behind it all. To understand why, we need to peer into the internal structures of these ancient creatures. Unlike mammals or birds, insects don't breathe through lungs. Instead, they rely on a system of tubes called tracheae that deliver oxygen directly to their tissues through diffusion. This method works well when the oxygen concentration is high enough, but it places a natural limit on body size. In today's atmosphere, with its 21% oxygen, this system begins to fail in large insects. The air simply can't diffuse quickly enough to support the energy demands of a bigger body. But in a world where oxygen made up 35% of the air, the rules changed. Diffusion became dramatically more efficient, and those biological ceilings that once held insects down were lifted. Suddenly, it was possible, perhaps even advantageous, for bugs to grow larger than ever before. The forests of the Carboniferous and Permian periods were alive with these giants. Imagine walking through a dense, shadowed swamp, where the air is warm and thick with humidity, and hearing the thunderous flap of insect wings above you. Creatures large enough to cast moving shadows as they passed overhead. On the ground, centipedes like Arthropleura crawled over the forest floor, some reaching lengths of over 2 meters. This wasn't merely a curious case of oversized bugs. It was an entirely different ecological system, one dominated by creatures that would seem like monsters today, yet were fully at home in their world. Size brought new advantages. Larger dragonflies, for example, became dominant aerial predators. They ruled the skies with unmatched agility and speed, their large eyes scanning the forest canopy for prey. Their wings, supported by the higher oxygen content, beat powerfully yet efficiently, giving them flight capabilities that allowed them to hunt, mate, and migrate over large distances. Predation, competition, and survival strategies were reshaped. With size came strength. With strength came dominance. And with dominance came evolutionary momentum that echoed for millions of years. But it wasn't just predators who benefited. Herbivorous arthropods grew as well. Larger bodies meant more efficient digestion of the tough plant materials that dominated these ancient forests. With the absence of microbial decomposers capable of breaking down lignin, many plants remained unprocessed unless eaten directly by animals. Insects played a crucial role in recycling nutrients, and their growing size allowed them to consume greater quantities, expanding their ecological role and influence. The very structure of the ecosystem depended on their appetites. Yet this size also came with risks. Larger creatures are more vulnerable to environmental fluctuations. They need more resources, take longer to reproduce, and are more easily harmed by extremes. And while the atmosphere offered plenty of oxygen, it also brought with it dangers that grew alongside opportunity. The more flammable air meant that wildfires were more common and more intense. Giant insects, with their large surface areas and delicate wings, were vulnerable in these burning landscapes. In a flash, entire populations could be wiped out, their bodies reduced to ash beneath a supercharged flame. Despite these hazards, the insect giants thrived for millions of years. Fossil records reveal dense deposits of their remains, often found alongside preserved forest beds, silent witnesses to a world where the balance of life leaned toward gigantism. The dynamics between predator and prey shifted. Aerial chases took place at a scale that dwarfs modern equivalents. The forest floor was a living tapestry of chitin and exoskeleton. Sounds, too, would have been different. The low humming of enormous wings, the clicking of massive mandibles, the vibrations of insect calls that traveled through the heavy air like drum beats. Even their reproduction may have been influenced by the atmosphere. With more oxygen available, embryonic development could proceed at faster rates, and metabolic processes in eggs and larvae were likely more efficient. Growth spurts in juveniles may have been faster than anything seen today, allowing these creatures to reach their massive adult sizes in surprisingly short periods of time. The energy of the environment wasn't just around them, it was within them, powering life from the inside out. As researchers study these ancient beings, many wonder what would happen if we recreated such conditions today. Could insects grow that large again? Could we witness a resurgence of giants? The answer is more complex than it seems, but the past speaks clearly. Under the right conditions, life will expand to fill the space it's given. Oxygen, invisible and silent, had once opened the door to a world where even the smallest of creatures could become titans. And those titans, in turn, left their imprint on the evolution of life itself. The air was alive, not just with breath, but with danger. As oxygen levels soared to 35%, the world became not only more vibrant, but also more volatile. In such a heavily oxygenated atmosphere, fire became a force of nature, unlike anything we know today. It could start more easily, spread more quickly, and burn with an intensity that made modern wildfires seem tame by comparison. This ancient world, teeming with towering forests and dry plant matter, was in many ways a tinderbox waiting to ignite. And when it did, it reshaped the planet's ecosystems in dramatic, fiery waves. The chemistry is straightforward but terrifying. Oxygen feeds fire. It doesn't ignite on its own, but it's what sustains and accelerates combustion. In today's air, with 21% oxygen, a spark can light a fire. but there's a natural limit to how hot and fast that fire can grow. At 35%, however, flames leap from leaf to leaf, tree to tree, with astonishing speed. Materials that would smolder today erupted instantly into flames. Even damp vegetation, usually resistant to burning, could catch fire in the right conditions. The balance of the ecosystem tilted toward combustion. Lightning storms, already a common occurrence in warm, humid climates, became regular ignition points. A single bolt striking the forest floor could unleash an inferno that raced across vast tracts of land. And because these dense forests lacked the microbial decomposers that modern ecosystems rely on, dead plant matter accumulated over time, building layers of dry, fibrous fuel ready to explode into flame. These fires were not occasional disruptions. They were ecological events, recurring with enough frequency and intensity to influence the directions of evolution itself. Plants, in particular, were forced to adapt. Those that could survive or even thrive after fire gained a crucial advantage. Some evolved thicker bark, capable of withstanding heat for longer periods. Others developed the ability to quickly re-sprout after being burned to the ground. In a world where fire was no longer a rare occurrence but a regular cycle, resilience became a dominant evolutionary trait. Fire-resistant species proliferated. Fire-sensitive ones faded or were driven into wetter, less flammable regions. The structure of entire forests began to reflect this shift, with certain regions becoming dominated by species uniquely adapted to survive or even benefit from fire. For animals, especially the massive arthropods and amphibians that ruled the land and sky, fire posed a more immediate and existential threat. Their size made them more vulnerable to the speed and unpredictability of wildfires. Unlike smaller creatures that could burrow or flee rapidly, larger species often had no choice but to endure or perish. The fossil record bears silent witness to these events. Charred remains of plant beds interspersed with the fossilized outlines of insect wings and amphibian bones, frozen in time at the edge of a firestorm. But fire didn't just destroy, it also renewed. It cleared dense undergrowth, opened up sunlight to the forest floor, and released nutrients locked in dead vegetation. After the flames passed, the land could erupt with new growth. Insects returned, birds and amphibians recolonized, and the cycle began again. Over time, fire became a kind of ecological sculptor, carving the landscape into zones of vulnerability and resilience. It created patches of young forest within the old, provided space for pioneering species, and shaped migration patterns. The atmosphere itself responded to this fiery regime. Each fire released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and ash into the air, altering climate patterns and feeding feedback loops that were both complex and far-reaching. Some scientists believe that these recurring fires may have contributed to cooling phases by pumping particulates into the upper atmosphere, shading the Earth from the sun. Others suggest the cumulative impact of fires helped regulate the high oxygen levels themselves. By burning massive amounts of biomass, carbon was released rather than sequestered, potentially slowing the continued rise of oxygen. Even the development of fire-adapted ecosystems introduced new strategies in reproduction. Some plant species began producing seeds that only germinated after exposure to fire, ensuring they would sprout in newly cleared, nutrient-rich environments. This tactic not only gave them an edge in post-fire regeneration, but tied their life cycles directly to the rhythm of combustion. Fire was no longer an interruption of life. It was embedded into its pattern. Insects, too, adapted. Some species developed behaviors that allowed them to sense the approach of fire, altering migration or reproduction cycles to avoid its path. Others evolved to take advantage of the post-fire landscape, laying eggs in freshly scorched wood or feeding on weakened plants that survived the blaze. The intricate relationship between fire and life became a dance of danger and opportunity. The effect of these frequent and ferocious fires was not limited to land. Ash and sediment washed into rivers and oceans, altering aquatic habitats, influencing the chemistry of ancient lakes and seas, and affecting marine life in unexpected ways. Fire, though born on land, cast a long shadow over water. The interconnectedness of ecosystems meant that nothing burned in isolation. Everything was touched by flame, directly or indirectly. Over millions of years, this fiery world became normal. Entire species evolved not just despite fire, but because of it. The evolutionary pressure fire applied, relentless, scorching, and cyclical, ensured that only those organisms capable of responding creatively to destruction would flourish. Fire became a test of fitness, a purifier and predator in its own right. It wasn't just part of the environment. It was a force that helped define it. The rise in atmospheric oxygen was not merely a background change. It became an intimate force that infiltrated the very machinery of life. While its external impacts reshaped ecosystems, fueled firestorms, and enlarged life forms, its most profound influence lay deep within organisms themselves. The internal world of biology, genes, cells, and molecular pathways was fundamentally altered in ways that would echo across evolutionary time. Oxygen, essential for respiration, began to push life into new metabolic territories, reshaping how energy was produced, stored, and used. At the heart of this transformation was aerobic respiration. This process, already present in earlier life forms, suddenly became vastly more efficient in the hyper-oxygenated world of the late Paleozoic. Aerobic respiration allows cells to produce ATP, the energy currency of life, by breaking down glucose with oxygen. Under high oxygen conditions, this process becomes far more productive than anaerobic alternatives. Organisms that could exploit this efficiently gained a powerful advantage. Muscles could work harder and longer. Recovery from exertion was quicker. Growth rates increased. The internal energy economy of life was no longer constrained by a limited oxygen supply. This metabolic revolution had cascading effects on physiology. Take vertebrates, for instance. In this oxygen-rich world, early tetrapods, those pioneering animals venturing fully onto land, were able to develop larger and more complex lung structures. Their circulatory systems adapted to move greater volumes of oxygenated blood. Heart chambers grew more efficient, and vascular networks became increasingly specialized. With more oxygen coursing through their systems, these creatures could grow larger, move with greater purpose, and inhabit a wider range of terrestrial niches. Evolution was no longer just adapting to the land. It was now optimizing life for an atmosphere brimming with fuel. But the influence of oxygen extended even further. It touched the very molecules that encode life. Oxygen is a reactive molecule, and in high concentrations, it can interact with DNA, proteins, and cell membranes. This meant that organisms not only had to evolve ways to use oxygen, but also to protect themselves from it. Oxidative stress, the cellular damage caused by reactive oxygen species, became a new evolutionary pressure. To survive, organisms developed intricate antioxidant systems capable of neutralizing these dangerous byproducts. Enzymes like superoxide, dismutase, and catalase evolved, forming the front line of cellular defense. These protective systems weren't just survival mechanisms, they were evolutionary responses, shaping how cells aged, divided, and healed. This molecular pressure may have even influenced the pace of evolution itself. Increased oxidative stress meant higher mutation rates in some lineages, particularly in environments where oxygen levels fluctuated rapidly. While many of these mutations were harmful, some provided novel traits, new enzymes, new cellular structures, new behaviors that allowed organisms to explore evolutionary paths that would have been impossible in a low oxygen world. Oxygen, in this way, became both the fuel and the fire of genetic innovation. In plants, the transformation was just as profound. High oxygen levels combined with intense photosynthetic activity altered not just growth rates, but internal cellular composition. Stomatal density, the tiny openings on leaves used for gas exchange, adjusted to balance oxygen release and carbon dioxide intake. The internal balance of sugars, starches, and signaling hormones evolved to cope with the abundance of energy and the constant pressure of oxidative damage. Some plants developed thicker leaves, more lignin-rich stems, or faster life cycles as strategies to harness or mitigate the new biochemical environment. Even root systems evolved in response, interacting with microbes that were themselves adapting to the elevated oxygen conditions in the soil. Reproductive biology, too, was shaped by the air. In both plants and animals, embryonic development became more oxygen-dependent. The growth of complex tissues, particularly invertebrates, required a steady and rich oxygen supply. Eggs were laid in moist environments, close to oxygen-rich surfaces. Embryos began to develop faster, cells dividing more rapidly, organ systems forming with greater complexity. Oxygen didn't just support life, it sculpted it, guiding its earliest forms and determining how it unfolded. Even behavior was influenced. Insects with access to abundant oxygen could sustain flight for longer periods, allowing for more elaborate mating dances, extended foraging, and complex territorial behaviors. Amphibians with stronger limbs and more efficient respiration could roam farther from water sources, hunt in wider ranges, and occupy new ecological roles. The very way life moved through space was a direct consequence of the air it breathed. Communication may have shifted as well. With more oxygen fueling more energy, vocalizations, particularly in early vertebrates, could become louder, longer, and more varied. Muscles used in sound production were more powerful, and brain regions involved in interpreting sound grew more complex. Social structures grew alongside biology, and new behaviors, cooperation, competition, and courtship began to emerge in more sophisticated forms. In this high-oxygen world, even rest and recovery took on new meaning. The capacity to heal from wounds, to regenerate lost tissue, or to recover from disease was enhanced. With more oxygen available at the cellular level, processes like inflammation, tissue repair, and immune responses became faster and more effective. Life wasn't just surviving longer, it was becoming more resilient, more robust, and more dynamic in its ability to bounce back from injury and adapt to challenge. Over generations, these advantages compounded. Oxygen became more than a background condition. It became a selective force, rewarding those who could harness its power and endure its dangers. The story of evolution during this time is inseparable from the story of oxygen, how it pushed life to grow, adapt, and specialize in new and remarkable ways. Every heartbeat, every breath, every leap of an early amphibian or flap of a giant dragonfly's wings carried within it the invisible influence of an atmosphere charged with potential. Life was not merely existing, it was accelerating, expanding, and experimenting on a planetary scale, driven by the silent, reactive molecule that once filled the skies in abundance. the abundance never lasted forever. As Earth turned through the slow rhythms of deep time, the atmospheric oxygen that had once surged to breathtaking levels began to decline. Gradually at first, then more markedly, the very breath of the biosphere shifted. The lush forests that had fueled the oxygen boom began to wane. The oxygen-rich air that once nurtured giants and fed infernos slowly thinned. And with it, life had to respond, once again adapting not to a world of abundance, but of loss. Multiple forces contributed to this dramatic decline. One of the most significant was the gradual fall of the great coal swamps. During the Carboniferous period, these dense, wet forests had locked vast amounts of carbon underground, turning plant matter into coal and releasing oxygen as a byproduct. But as the climate began to shift, cooling in some regions, drying in others, these swamps receded. The lush expanses that had once acted as planetary oxygen factories disappeared or fragmented. Without their relentless photosynthetic output, the oxygen input into the atmosphere diminished year after year, century after century. But there was more at play than just vegetation. Earth's tectonic activity began to reshape the land. Supercontinents formed and broke apart. Mountains rose and oceans shifted, altering wind patterns, ocean currents, and precipitation cycles. As these slow geological changes unfolded, they affected the spread and stability of forests, wetlands, and other ecosystems vital to maintaining high oxygen levels. Deserts expanded. Some areas became too cold for dense plant life. In others, nutrient-poor soils limited growth. The breathing lungs of Earth began to shrink, and with them, the atmospheric balance tilted toward a new equilibrium. Meanwhile, decomposition processes evolved. The microbes and fungi that had once been incapable of breaking down lignin, the tough, woody material in plants, had finally caught up. Around the end of the Carboniferous, fungi began producing enzymes capable of efficiently decomposing wood. This was a silent revolution. Suddenly, the massive accumulation of dead plant matter that had been buried and turned to coal began to break down more quickly above ground. Instead of sequestering carbon and releasing oxygen, these processes now returned carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The great carbon burial project of the Paleozoic was ending, and the oxygen-rich legacy it left behind began to fade. The biological consequences of this shift were immediate and profound. The giant insects, once dominant and unchallenged in the sky, began to disappear. As oxygen levels fell, their tracheal systems could no longer support their massive bodies. Diffusion of oxygen through their networks of air tubes became insufficient. Slowly, evolutionary pressure reversed the trend of gigantism. Wingspans shrank. Exoskeletons became thinner. The buzzing of once mighty insects was reduced to the smaller, lighter tones of creatures scaled down to survive in a thinner atmosphere. Amphibians, too, faced a reckoning. Many of the early tetrapods that had thrived in high oxygen conditions struggled to adapt to the declining supply. Oxygen had supported their relatively inefficient lungs, allowed them to grow larger, and enabled slow-moving, heavy-bodied lifestyles. But with less oxygen, these same traits became liabilities. Some lineages dwindled or disappeared altogether. Others were outcompeted by more efficient air-breathing reptiles, who evolved stronger lungs and more advanced cardiovascular systems better suited to the new atmospheric regime. It was a time of transition, of winners and losers in the face of a changing sky. Entire ecosystems shifted. Fire regimes changed. With less oxygen, fires became less frequent and less intense. The forests that survived the climate changes became more patchy, and new plant species began to dominate. Gymnosperms, with their tough seeds and adaptations to drier climates, spread across the land. The sprawling fern forests of the Carboniferous gave way to new green dynasties. The planet's botanical identity was being rewritten. In the oceans, too, the consequences of atmospheric decline were felt. Reduced oxygen levels in the atmosphere translated into lower levels dissolved in the oceans. This led to the expansion of anoxic zones, regions of the ocean depleted of oxygen. These areas became hostile to most marine life, driving extinctions and reducing biodiversity. Organisms adapted for low oxygen environments, such as certain bacteria and anaerobic protozoa, proliferated, while larger, more oxygen-hungry marine creatures suffered. The ocean became more stratified, its chemistry altered, its biological rhythms disrupted. Evolution responded, as it always does, but not without cost. The grand experiment of high oxygen life had run its course, and now the biosphere was forced to adapt to scarcity. Respiratory systems became more efficient. Blood became better at carrying oxygen. Lungs evolved new architectures. Life grew leaner, more mobile, more conservative in its energy use. Where once there had been giants and extravagance, now there was restraint and efficiency. But perhaps the most profound consequence of the oxygen decline was its role in clearing the stage for new evolutionary players. The fall of the giants left niches unoccupied. Reptiles, small and adaptable, moved into these openings. They began to diversify rapidly. Over time, they gave rise to new forms, some of which would eventually dominate the earth in their own right. In this way, the end of the oxygen-rich era did not mark the end of life's expansion, but rather its redirection. Evolution took a different path, shaped by new constraints and new possibilities. The fossil record captures this slow turning of the planetary page. It shows the fading presence of giant insects, the dwindling of amphibians, the rise of new plant forms and animal groups better suited to the altered world. Each layer of rock, each deposit of coal or fossilized fern tells a story of a biosphere adapting to a subtle but relentless shift in the very air itself. A reminder that even something as invisible as oxygen can steer the fate of life on Earth with quiet, overwhelming power. As the Earth's oxygen levels fell, so too did an age of giants, fire, and extraordinary life. Yet in that quieting breath, evolution found new direction, and life marched on, resilient, adaptable, and ever-changing. Thank you for joining this journey through deep time. Wherever you are in the world tonight, may the echoes of ancient air lull you into peaceful rest. Good night, and until next time, keep wondering about the world that once was.